Okay, good afternoon, friends. Apologies for a little bit of the delay due to some tech issues as often happens. So welcome to this third annual Summer Institute's public lecture. So those are in the room, the Summer Institute participants, as well as other guests, you are welcome, as well as those joining us online. I'm Mutturaj Swami, the director of the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide. And we have today with us Richard Lewney, who will be delivering the public lecture to us. And the session will be chaired by Dr. Professor Esther Chung Kim from Claremont McKenna College. And she will chair the session and she will introduce the speaker as well as moderate the session. But just a word about Professor Esther. So she, I thought that she'll be apt to chair the session. She has an interest in economics and faith. Her recent book with Oxford University Press was Economics of Faith, Reforming Poor Relief in the Early Modern Europe, and which so we thought is very apt to the theme of the Summer Institute, and particularly theme of the public lecture today. So hence she has kindly agreed to chair the session. So welcome Richard and Harold.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today. Mr. Richard Lewney is the chair of Cambridge Econometrics. It is a spin-off from the University of Cambridge's Department of Applied Economics. He has served as the company's managing director for 2 decades, from the mid-1990s, applying economic modeling to policy analysis, policy evaluation, and possible futures. Main clients are NGOs and government organizations. In recent years, his particular focus has been on the economic impact of climate change mitigation policies. And we've already discussed quite a bit about climate change earlier today. So this dovetails very nicely with that. He's also an assembly accredited lay preacher in the United Reformed Church and regularly leads worship in churches and around Cambridge. He is the convener of the reference group that oversees the United Reformed Church's global justice program called Commitment for Life. He is also the trustee of the Cambridge Trust for New Thinking in Economics, which promotes development of ideas better suited to addressing real-world economic, social, and of course, environmental challenges. He studied here at Cambridge. He told me that he left thinking he would never come back, but alas, he has come back and now has been here for many years. He also actually had a stint as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So we had also a chance to talk a little bit about the country on the other side of the pond. So with that, I leave you to today's presentation, and we will have a time for a question and answer. So hold on to your questions till that time. Thank you.
So thanks very much. It's an honor for me to be here speaking to you, and I particularly thank Mutturaj for the invitation to do that. And for those of you who are participating in this week's Summer Institute, well, I wish you insight and inspiration as you wrestle with this massively important theme of poverty in the church. For those of you who are here in Cambridge, welcome to the English summer. I have a particular reason to be glad to open up this theme together with you because of my own particular journey. It was really the scandal of global inequality and poverty that pushed me to study economics when I was a teenager. And when my Christian faith came alive in those student years, my sense was that economics would be a vocation for me, which is kind of how it's turned out, both in the values that the consultancy company that I've led espouses, and in the impact that we seek to have with the economic studies we carry out. Now, of course, all the world's great faiths teach some sort of obligation to care for the poor and vulnerable. And from the Christian tradition, according to the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth spoke often about the power that wealth has to distort our moral compass. And he gave, as we know, a wide interpretation of the Levitical commands to love your neighbor as yourself, crossing boundaries of race and class and not limited by geography or clan. And this mandate to care for the poor has, of course, motivated churches to find ways to support people in need in their own community. So in this country, we've seen the expansion of food banks, often based in a local church, particularly in response to the COVID pandemic and then to the cost of living crisis that been prompted by them. But typically, the actions of Christians have not been limited just to this kind of practical support at the local level. Representatives of the church also seek to enter the public policy debate. For example, highlighting the living conditions. Oops.
Yeah.
I pause. Do you need to connect to that?
They need to see it as well. It's going to go here on the side.
But I
Those in
can't,
the room.
but I haven't got any internet connection, so I can't go by Zoom.
No,
Okay, all right. Pause.
yeah. It's only for the people here in the room.
Oh, I see, sorry, so I've got to, so I'll operate at your.
That's all I
your
see
copy.
it.
Right, got it. Yeah, let me just make sure. that's
Good.
working. Right, so, yeah, so I was saying, well as offering some practical support at the local level, that, as it were, ground up, Christians seek to enter the public policy debate. Say highlighting living conditions of people living in poverty or criticizing the impact, say, of a particular law on the poor. And people in government, really whatever government, don't much like being criticized, especially by someone who isn't a politician, but still has a public profile. And one reason is, one response to that is to say that the church should stay out of politics, like Jesus didn't. Another is to give a sort of patronizing smile and say that church leaders just don't understand the complexity of the economic and financial system, whereas politicians apparently do. Anyway, now I think anyone has a right to speak out about economic and social policy, politicians, church leaders, ordinary Christians. It's not just something to be left to technocratic experts. So in this talk, I want to explore what economists have said about economics and poverty and how these ideas have been or could be taken up by Christians in public debate. And then, because I'm a data kind of person, I want to confront those narratives with a bit of evidence about trends in global poverty, and then draw some conclusions for us at the end. So that's where I'm going. So starting with the ideas that influence us, the great 20th century Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes famously emphasized the power of ideas to frame our thinking. And in the non-inclusive language of his time, he wrote this: the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Defunct meaning dead. So you get the sense, don't you, that Keynes must have experienced a number of frustrating conversations with men, as it would largely have been in those days, men in positions of leadership in politics, business, or the media, who spouted common sense without realizing that they were regurgitating a dumbed down version of what some economist had written decades earlier. Now, obviously, just because some economist writes something, it doesn't mean that it will gain wide currency. Ideas, even good ones, don't simply gain acceptance on their merits. but they take or lose hold in wider society through all the social forces that make one way of thinking attractive or another repellent. There are some complex psychological and sociological processes at work, but clearly a major driver is our own self-interest. As the American writer and activist Upton Sinclair wrote, again in the non-inclusive language of his time, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding. So here's an example on the theme of climate. Just now we're seeing this huge political polarization over mitigation policy, and the question of blanked it, yeah. Oops, sorry. Yeah, no, blanked it.
Oh, you got this
Yeah,
one.
it's deliberate.
Oh, okay. Can you just let me know?
It's entirely, so we have this polarization of the climate change mitigation policy, and also the question of financial support for a loss and damage fund for those suffering the worst impacts. Now, it's entirely understandable, isn't it, if not really acceptable, that those with the most to lose oppose the changes we need to make. So, for example, the current stock market valuation of oil and gas companies only makes sense if they will be able to extract and sell far more fossil fuels than will fit within a reasonable budget for future greenhouse gas emissions. So, of course, they'll lobby and fund the campaigns of politicians who will vote to block climate action. And similarly, the countries that have contributed most to the stock of greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases, principally, of course, the countries in the West, they're the ones that are, well, let's say, dragging their feet in international negotiations about paying into a loss and damage fund. So, of course, it's no surprise that we jump to defend our own narrow interests. But what I find more interesting, and I think more fundamentally challenging, is the way that our interests condition not just our actions, our decisions, but our very thinking, our understanding. It's not just that fossil fuel lobbyists block change, it's that a good number of people in places where carbon emissions are high are genuinely skeptical about the evidence for anthropogenic climate change. They don't accept the science. Where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. The seat of our thoughts, our passions, our desires, appetites, affections, purposes, endeavors, our very understanding. And I don't think I appreciated that when I used to get together with other Christian economics students. We thought we could come up with a distinctively Christian view on the big questions of our day. I suppose we thought that somehow we could stand above or outside of the influence of our own culture, as if we could gain access to God's view of things. But of course, the same pressures affect us all, and they influence the way that the church thinks about things. As we know, climate skepticism is particularly pronounced among evangelical Protestants in the US. Another example, some Dutch Reformed Church theologians in South Africa were able to provide a biblical justification for apartheid. And to bring us to today's subject, when we claim that we're developing a Christian response to wealth and poverty, we're still subject to the risk that we're slaves of some defunct economist, one whose ideas are fortunately consistent with the self-interest of our tribe. And of course, that's a major reason why economic, political, and theological debate about poverty needs to hear the voices of those from different countries and backgrounds, because that might just help us to be conscious of the prejudices and prior beliefs we bring with us. So, some economic narratives about poverty. If defunct economists have as important an impact on practical women and men as Keynes suggested, I want to suggest to you three of the narratives that economics has offered about the socioeconomic system and poverty. And in each case, I'll give a statement to summarize the narrative, and I'll associate with it, just for fun really, a verse from the book of Proverbs. It's more illustration than exegesis. So here's the first narrative. The market rewards those with something to offer. Okay, so I have here a picture of a woman with excellent produce for sale in the marketplace. She's going to do all right, it seems. My associated proverb is a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. So clearly that proverb condemns laziness. I think it would be misleading to say that this proverb blames all poverty on the fecklessness of the poor. As perhaps we'll see, there are other verses in Proverbs that certainly don't suggest that. But there is an economic narrative that says that while it's not necessarily their fault, it is their lack, their misfortune. So people might be poor because they have no skills, the wrong skills. They might have a chronic illness that makes them less productive, maybe prevents them from working at all. Perhaps they lack commitment, trustworthiness, or any of the other attributes that make someone a good worker. A slack hand causes poverty. Whatever the reason, you're poor because you lack what the economy needs. And underlying this is what I think has been the dominant economic narrative for decades. The economic system is a market. People come to the market to sell what they have and buy what they want. What you earn reflects your value to others, your customers, of what you have to offer, and how easily others, your competitors, could supply the same thing. So, for example, a doctor earns a lot in the private sector because people are willing to pay a lot for better health, and because it takes a rare level of academic ability plus a long period of training to become a doctor. They can command a higher wage. A childcare worker earns relatively little, even though it's very important to parents who that their children are safe and happy. But there are a lot of people who can and will do the job at a low pay rate. It doesn't require extensive qualification or training. Another example, print workers used to require a high level of skill, but technology has made those skills redundant. And so however skilled they might be, a print worker couldn't earn much nowadays. Now, in that world, is it possible that you do have good marketable skills, but you don't earn the going rate? Well, yes, if your access to the market is somehow obstructed. And that, in a way, becomes the explanation of poverty in this way of thinking. So it might be obstructed because you live far from the market that you're trying to serve, or because there's some kind of restriction on trade. Maybe you have to have a government license to operate, and you don't have the friends in government to get that. Or maybe your market is in another country and there are import tariffs designed to protect that country's own firms and workers from your competition. So what's the solution to poverty in that narrative? Well, first, remove the trade barriers, because while they're in place, nothing else will help much. Then invest, yes, in better health, education, training to make you more productive, more marketable. And if communication links are poor, invest to make them better. Encourage inward investment by multinational companies that are already experienced in your kind of business, and so you can work with good equipment and benefit from their existing market access. So that's the narrative. Now, Christians who adopt this narrative, and there are, or certainly have been some, are internationalists. They campaign against the kind of tariffs currently being advocated by both Republicans and Democrats in the US, because they think it's immoral to bar the access to US markets of producers in poor countries. And they find biblical support in the Hebrew scriptures for, as we've seen, hard work earning a good reward, and for impartial justice. They may see God's hand in the working of the market, harnessing sinful greed so that the unintended consequence of people working primarily for their own gain is to benefit society more widely. They may favour small government, private enterprise, although they still call for effective enforcement of competition policy so that markets work as they should. They may favour initiatives designed to improve the skills of the poor so they're better able to compete. Generally, they worry less about growing inequality because they think entrepreneurs should be rewarded and that growth does bring benefits to the poor. So it's a trickle down, if you like. They may not know it, but they favour what's been called the Washington consensus in the liberalisation policies that have traditionally been prescribed by the IMF and the World Bank in return for support to countries. They emphasise trade over aid. They might be, let's say, old-fashioned Republicans. So if that narrative was broadly right, then what would we expect to see in the evidence? We'd expect to see countries that adopt the policy prescription improve their economic performance, catch up with the richer countries. Their wages and living standards would rise, whereas those who don't adopt the prescription would lag behind. Okay, that's the first narrative. Basically, the market works. Second narrative is the market works to make the rich even richer and the poor are left behind. My second picture here shows a game of Monopoly, which is a game in which you either accumulate all the wealth or you go bankrupt. It's a zero-sum game. And my associated proverb is the wealth of the rich is their fortified city, but poverty is the ruin of the poor. It emphasizes the security or the lack of it that comes from having wealth or not. So this second narrative highlights what are typically called in the jargon forces of cumulative causation. In other words, a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, can go up or down. It means that if someone gets a head start, they'll push further ahead. If someone else lags behind, they'll fall further and further behind. So as a picture of that, you might think of the way that sometimes social media automatically gives greater prominence to posts that have a large number of views. So popularity becomes self-fulfilling. Or the way that a successful professional football club secures more TV and sponsorship income, and so is better able to buy better players and boost its success further. It's kind of a winner-takes-all world. So in that way of thinking, divergence between rich and poor isn't due to an obstacle to the operation of the market, which is what the first narrative says, but rather it is the result of the operation of the market. Like the first narrative, what people earn reflects the value of what they produce, but unlike the first narrative, that value is driven by a process that pushes some up and others down. In that kind of economy, larger firms gain advantages that allow them to further increase their market share. Successful cities attract more firms and workers. You'd see growing divergence within countries, between successful and unsuccessful regions, and also between countries, the ones that have the successful firms and the ones that don't. Christians who adopt this narrative might see the outcome of the operation of the free market as the way the world works, and contrast that with the way of the kingdom. They understand Jesus' pronouncement that the poor are blessed as deliberately counterposing the kingdom of the world, which made them poor, with the kingdom of God, which raises them up. So they're wary about the policies to liberalize trade and the imposition of the Washington consensus as a condition of economic support for poorer countries. They interpret the biblical mandate to care for the poor and vulnerable not just in support, in terms of support for those who fall on hard times, say due to drought, but in terms of intervention that seek to counter or overcome self-fulfilling disadvantage. They welcome bottom-up initiatives to improve skills and infrastructure, but they don't think they're enough to counter cumulative causation. They might talk about structural sin, emphasizing that poverty isn't just about individual misfortune or individual exploitation, but it's a consequence of the way the system works. They might support restrictions that aim to block unfair trade, to forestall the loss of a country's key industry. And in that sense, they might be Democrats or New Republicans. Now, if that second narrative is broadly right, what would we expect to see? Well, we'd expect to see growing divergence between successful and left behind places, the opposite of what would be expected under the first narrative if the market is left to work unfettered. We'd expect to see left behind places and countries specializing in industries that the rich countries need as low value inputs for their high value production, and prevented from taking steps up the ladder. So that's narrative number 2, cumulative causation. Narrative number 3 goes like this: the rich use economic, political, and physical power to increase their share. In this narrative, people are poor because they lack power. That may be the economic power that comes from having what the market needs, or from having a dominant position in the market, or it may be the political power to help obtain that economic power. Or it may simply be the capacity to impose or resist exploitation imposed by physical force. This picture is a quotation in German by the playwright Bertolt Brecht, which translates as, "If I wasn't poor, you wouldn't be rich." And my third proverb is, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave." It emphasizes the power advantage that wealth brings. Now, this narrative can be taken up by people on both the right and the left of the political spectrum. On the libertarian right, there's a real deep suspicion about big government, seeing it as captive to the interests of big business and finance. George Soros, Bill Gates. On the left, there is a similar suspicion about capture by big business, notably the use of foreign policy interventions by government to promote the interests of their large multinational companies. An example of that, if you know about it, might be the pressing of investor-state dispute settlement, which allows companies to sue governments if they change their policy and in a way that goes against the interest of the investing company. Here, free market means preventing national governments from prioritizing their country's needs and pushing countries into a dependent role in the global economy. Now, Christians who adopt the right-leaning version of this narrative might emphasize the unjust treatment of Jesus by the religious leaders and Roman rulers. They might today focus on places where Christians face discrimination on account of their faith. Christians who adopt the left-leaning version focus on the way that different kinds of power are applied or resisted in the Bible. They may draw on the various forms of liberation theology. They may read the Gospels and the book of Revelation, as is said, through the lens of empire. Now, this third narrative, or broadly right, we'd expect to see again a growing divergence between rich and poor, with the position of the rich secured and defended at different times and different places through a range of economic power, ideological persuasion, government interventions, and physical force. Those are the narratives. Now, what does the evidence say about this, about the evidence from economic development and policy? Does it back up one of these narratives more than another? So I'm going to show you some pictures just to summarize some trends in income and poverty and inequality. Just a footnote, which you can ignore if you don't care. One of the metrics economists often use to talk about differences in prosperity between countries is GDP, gross domestic product. That just means the wages and profits earned in the economy. It's by no means all that matters, but it can be useful if it's used appropriately, which of course I'm going to do. So let's start by looking at inequality between countries on that measure. So this map shows GDP per adult in the different countries, and it goes from low values are yellow and high values are red. And it shows kind of, I guess, what you would pretty much expect, is to say that the global south has got the lower values, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. You see that in Asia, it's Southeast Asia, it's a bit better than in sub-Saharan Africa. This is in 2022, the last year, available data. See that China has actually made it finally just into the second tier of this kind of dark orange color. But the highest values are in Europe, North America, and Australia, plus some countries that have mineral wealth. So you see the oil-rich Arab states and North Africa, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Guyana. I'm throwing diamonds in Botswana because I used to live there. But even if we leave out those extreme cases of where, if you look at Qatar's GDP per head is crazily high. Even if we leave those out, it's still the case that GDP per adult in the US maybe 20 to 30 times what it is in some of these sub-Saharan African countries. So there's, as we know, big inequality between countries. Now, but a reasonable question is, well, how has that changed? It might be bad, but maybe it was worse before. Maybe it's heading in the right direction. So this chart shows it's the same measure of GDP per adult, but now each of these lines represents a country or global region, and it's relative to the US. Okay, so we have, for example, the EU number here in 2022 is a bit below 70% of the US level. Okay. What you see is that over the 50 years covered in this chart from 1970 to the early 2020s, things don't change that much. The differences are broadly stable, except for the obvious example of China and to some extent India. Okay. So there's a kind of stability in the gaps not being closed, except with those two examples. Now, it doesn't mean to say that incomes aren't improving, because they have been improving. It's just that in most places they've grown at about the same rate as the US, so the gap hasn't closed. Okay. Now, as some of you are perhaps thinking, this GDP per adult capped figure is a country average, right? You might have GDP growing, but all of that income accruing to the rich, so there may be no improvement for the poor. So we can take a step in that direction by looking not just at that GDP measure, but also life expectancy. Now, still looking at the average for the country, but changes over time in life expectancy. And if you think about it, the rich probably already have a pretty high level of life expectancy. So the average goes up. It's probably because somebody further down the ranking is improving. So it's a kind of it's a bit more helpful. Okay. And I'm going to move to a slide which comes from the internet, which might take a moment or two to load. Oh, no, that is. Okay, so what's this show? Yeah, it's not going to work for me because I'm not connected. Sorry. Anyway, but I'll tell you what happens. So this is 1950. Each of the bubbles represents a country. The size of the bubble represents the population of the country. So those big pink bubbles are, of course, China and India. The colors represent different world regions. Pink is East or Southeast Asia. It also includes Australia. Yellow is Europe, including Russia. Green are the Americas, and the turquoise is Africa. Now, sadly, I don't think I'm going to be able to run this to show you what happens over time, but let's just make sure that it's in case. Yeah. So what happens if I could click on that button, and you can go to the site yourself, gapminder.org. It shows how the bubbles move over time. Okay. I should have said So if you're far to the right, you're wealthy, you have high GDP per capita. If you're higher up, you have a higher life expectancy. So in 1950, on the whole, if you were wealthier, you had higher life expectancy, kind of what you'd expect, right? There's quite a lot of variation. There are countries that are quite poor but don't do too badly on life expectancy, but that's pretty much the, so there's a kind of a slope like this. Now, if I could run this over time, what you see is the bubbles move around a lot, but from about 1990, the pink ones, the East Asian ones, move, and especially China and to some extent India, and they surge up. And by 2022, what you're left with is essentially the sub-Saharan African countries, the turquoise blobs remain in the lower end, okay? And the other thing about it is that the line flattens. So life expectancy does improve in most places, even the poorer places. And that reflects the impact of measures to address basic health, clean water. It's a major contributor to that. So you do get some improvements both in income and also in things that probably are affecting what's going on for life for people at the poorest end. That is to say, with life expectancy. But let's look at inequality explicitly within countries. Now, this map shows the share that the top 10% of people, the richest 10% of people, take of income in a given year, okay? So in 2022, the top 10% were taking anywhere from 20% of income to over half of income in the dark, in the countries represented by the darkest color, okay? And I don't know if that's what you would expect or not, because we tend to think of there being huge inequality in this country and even more so in the United States. You have lots of very rich people. In the poorer countries, there are still some very rich people and a lot of poor people. So inequality is kind of more extreme in most of those countries. Now, just a word about that. I mean, these are estimates. Not all countries report it. The rich pretty good at hiding their income, but nevertheless, this is the best we can do, and it's already pretty shocking. It's even harder to get data on wealth. This is income, which is how much you earn in a year. Wealth is how much you own at any given point in time. But the estimates there are show much larger disparities. The top 10% might own 2/3 or even 3/4 of national wealth in the most unequal places. For the most part, that hasn't changed over 40 years. That kind of disparity has remained, except in faster growing countries like China and India, where it's increased. If you think about that, that kind of makes sense. The rapid development of China and the entrepreneurs, more millionaires and billionaires. Okay, now this is inequality, which you might think of as relative poverty. We're also interested in absolute poverty, right? Now, relative poverty matters because wealth brings power, including the power to preserve your existing privilege. You can buy your children an elite education, you can buy political influence. But we are interested in absolute poverty because even if the gap between rich and poor isn't closing, it may be that everyone's moving up. Maybe fewer people are starving, maybe infant mortality is declining. We saw that life expectancy was increasing, at least on average. So here's a question for you. The World Bank's measure of extreme poverty is to live on less than $2 a day, roughly speaking, today's money. Okay, so in 1980, a bit less than half of the world population were in extreme poverty, 40%. What would you think is the share today? Well, as we've seen, some countries have improved in terms of income. On the other hand, the world population has been growing, probably growing faster in the poorer places. So hard to guess, isn't it? The answer, it turns out, is 10%. This is good news, right? The numbers in extreme poverty have declined. And that is what this chart shows, measured in numbers of people. So on that same measure, on less than $2 a day, back in 1990, 2 billion people in total, and now a bit less than 1 billion, despite the growth of the population. If you look a bit closer, the different shadings are different global regions, and this dark blue one is East Asia and Pacific, so that's where China and India are. So that's the main driver of the reduction in the total, has been the reduction in poverty, particularly in China, to some extent in India. Whereas this turquoise bar is sub-Saharan Africa, where the number in 2022, that width there, is larger than it was in 1990. So both things are going on. There have been reductions in absolute poverty, but not everywhere. Okay. Now, I was going to show you another chart from the internet, which again won't work. This is how it starts in 1950. So what's this showing? Well, each of these coloured pyramids represent different world regions. Again, the world regions are shown up here. And what they are is the population in that world region. So pink is, as we said, Southeast Asia and Australasia. And what it shows is the distribution of people, what their daily income is estimated to have been. So most people in that region, the most sort of frequently found value is around $1 a day in 1950. Some people much less, a few people, because the pyramid goes on here, were getting up to $10 or $20 a day. I hope you get the idea. Now, again, if you play this running forward, what happens is the main thing that you see happen, consistent with that previous chart, is that pyramid shifts, and particularly from the 90s onwards. And most in this year, half of the world's population were in extreme poverty. By 2022, it's less than 10%, and most of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what this nice diagram would show, if I could show it to you, is that, okay, so people have been moved out of extreme poverty, but they've basically gone from extremely poor to very poor. And they're still only on $5 or $10 a day, which is still very poor. But they're out of that, that bracket of the most severe poverty. Okay, enough looking at data, although personally I can't get enough of it. Let's move on to draw some conclusions. What do I think are the takeaways from all of this? Well, the countries that have seen the fastest catch up in economic growth are in East Asia. Taiwan, South Korea, before them Japan, and in the past 3 decades, China. They've benefited from being integrated into the global economy. Sounds like the market works, but actually they've achieved this by adopting a model of state-led, export-driven capitalism. They didn't just leave it to the market, but they did benefit greatly from exploiting the opportunities from the era of global economic integration, when world trade was growing very fast and barriers were coming down. That transformation has been associated with a stronger concentration of wealth and power. Stronger regional differences. I didn't show them, but they're certainly there in China. High inequality in income and wealth. But also, as we've seen, reductions in the most extreme forms of poverty, especially for those who moved to jobs in urban centres. And improvements in life expectancy thanks to state provision. So in the case of China, where the biggest reductions in poverty have occurred, these changes have obviously been pushed through by an authoritarian government. India's catch-up has been a bit slower. Its economic transformation has been a bit more oriented towards, as we say, exports of services, so things like software or telephone support services. They tend to create fewer jobs for the really low skilled workers than you get with manufacturing assembly. And poverty reduction has relied more on government subsidies and income transfers than it did in China. Contrast is in sub-Saharan Africa. Economies have continued to focus heavily on mineral exports, not least to supply the rapid industrialization in China. That kind of development doesn't create so many jobs. The income accrues to foreign companies and national governments. Some governments have used the income to improve health and education provision. I'll cite again, Botswana. In others, the cozy relationship with the multinational investors fostered corruption. Inequalities increased. Growth rates have generally been lower than in East Asia, and I'd see this as the other side of the coin of East Asia's success. And then I haven't got a bullet for this, but that narrative that I said was the dominant one for several decades, that the market works and trade is good. As a result of that, large numbers of traditional manufacturing jobs in Europe and the US were lost in sectors producing goods that were now coming from East Asia. The argument was, and you still hear it sometimes, that consumers benefit from the lower prices of Chinese imports. Of course we do. Here's why benefit. But it's only true if you haven't lost your job or you can find a decent alternative. And a result has been urban decay in traditional manufacturing areas in the developed countries. You don't see much of it in Cambridge because we didn't have much traditional manufacturing industry. But as we go to the north of England or go to coalfield areas, we see plenty of it. Right. So quickly some conclusions. As you probably worked out, my own thinking is tending towards the second and third narratives. The same forces that have driven rapid economic growth in East Asia and which funded the reduction in extreme poverty have driven greater inequality, have kept much of Africa in the role of supplier of raw materials. But they've also driven environmental degradation, but that's a whole other lecture. Maybe you've already had it. So I find compelling, I'm not a theologian and you're way ahead of me in this, but I find compelling the kind of theology that exposes the use of power, highlights the challenge that Jesus presented to the powers and authorities of his day. And for me, both the evidence of that theology lead in or inform these kinds of church action on poverty. Obviously, yes, relief for the immediate needs, but also the kind of local economic development or development more generally, the kind of local development that equips and empowers local people to challenge the social structures that hold them back. Support for movements that hold governments to account for their action to help the poor escape poverty within their own country and internationally. And the exposure of the self-serving narratives that preserve and accentuate inequality. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Thank you.